Thanks everyone for coming this evening. Welcome to Vice-Chancellor, our honoured guests, and to my fellow staff and colleagues at the university to this first annual interdisciplinary event this year on the concept of motion. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob just to give us a few words before we kick off.
Chris, thank you very much. And can I add my words of welcome to Chris's, and in particular a welcome Annamarie Phelps, who's Vice Chair of the British Olympic Association, and Sarah-Jayne who's Director of Smart Mobility at Ford Europe. Everyone's welcome, but you two in particular. I'm delighted that you've been able to come and join us and contribute to a special evening. We do great things at this university, but any university, if I was to say to every one of you in the room, put Loughborough on one side, for you, which of this country's or which of the world's top universities, the ones that are now in your mind are principally because of their research. Let's take the learning and teaching bit as read. That's got to be high quality, but it's the research that marks an organisation like Loughborough out. And I can't think of a better topic for us in an interdisciplinary way to have leading off the Institute for Advanced Studies programme this year. The IAS is an important part of what we do. Of course, we do research principally in our schools and our academic disciplines. You know, in here, I'm a geographer by training, but some of the most interesting questions and some of the most interesting research challenges, in my view, sits at the interface of disciplines. It's where disciplines come together and you can look at things in an interdisciplinary, or can I say, even dare, post-disciplinary way. And that in part is what the IAS is all about, but it's also about bringing distinguished guests to the campus, either for an evening like this evening or for longer periods of time, where we, who are regular members of the university community, can interact with those people in a way that adds value to what we do, and also in particular, I think, gives us food for thought and things to think about. I need to thank Marshall Meskimen, who is the director of the IAS, and Chris, you and Vicky, who I think are the leads for this theme. So thanks to all of you. But most importantly, I must hand on to other people who can outline what the evening is particularly about, so we can all listen to those who very kindly come to contribute to the debate this evening. So Chris, am I handing back over to you? The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob, for that introduction. This is the first ever year-long theme run by the IAS at the university. And when our team, the Sport and Exercise Beacon, submitted a bid to host the theme, we were reinforced by how central it was to the work that we do and the expertise we have across a variety of areas of the university in sport, technology, engineering, design, social sciences, the arts, and some of the other areas. And motion as a topic is fundamental to the human condition and to the environments in which human beings operate. It extends well beyond the moving human as a physical entity, in walking, running, jumping, throwing, to encompass forms of transportation, cycling, rail travel, and of course the vehicles of the future, which we'll hear about today, I'm sure, to assisted living in terms of wheelchair use and prosthetic limb design, to personal comfort in terms of thermal comfort in buildings, to comfort in clothing and optimal textiles for the tasks and the duties that we have to perform in our daily lives, to be comfortable in moving around the space and duties in specific environments. It embraces life course changes and the changes and movements in our personal identities and our personal qualities over the lifespan, transitions from youth to adulthood, from one career to the next career, to precision engineering and the areas of laser micrometry, optics and robotics. And finally to artistic performance and the drama and storytelling through dance. And this is an aspect of motion that draws in upwards of 10 million viewers on a Saturday night. You know, whether it's the motion through emotion and skill of Stacey Dewey's foxtrot, of Faye Tozer's rumba, or Kate Silverton's attempt at a sandbag, although my personal favourite is Jay's Jive from a few years ago. So this academic year, we've brought together or bringing together upwards of a dozen international researchers from many of these disciplines to visit both Loughborough campuses and to share their knowledge and to work with us on trying to extend and build upon our research expertise in these particular areas. And I just want to share with you a short video of how we've crafted the main themes and those you can expect to see on our campuses. So, and we're finally adding another final theme as well in terms of motion and the arts, performing arts and theatrical performances, and trying to finalise that theme with the help of Marsha for the coming year, as well as the sixth theme in the concept. So, I love putting that video together. It was so challenging to try to storyboard it all, but it was a really motivating and enjoyable process. In terms of tonight's event itself, and as the hot topics in motion, we wanted to launch the motion theme, an event that actually explored the hot topics in motion. And arguably we focused on two areas, sport and technology. And probably that was maybe more of a personal bias that I had, because when I was an undergraduate here, starting in 1989, we were LUT, Loughborough University of Technology, and known for sport and engineering and technology at that time, 30 years ago. So we felt it would be interesting to hear the contrasting perspectives on motion from these two areas, and also see where some of the complementarity may lie. So here we go. I'm delighted, as the VC pointed out, to be welcoming and hearing from two very high-profile guests who genuinely bring stakeholder expertise from the two areas of sport and transport technology. Annamarie Phelps, CBE, the Vice Chair of the BOA, British Olympic Association, and Sarah-Jayne Williams, Director of Smart Mobility at Ford Europe. And we'll be hearing from those two ladies concurrently, followed by a transition into a panel discussion where I'll welcome Vicky Tolfrey, Professor of Applied Disability Sport and Director of the Harrison Centre on our campus, and Martin Passmore, Professor of Automotive Aerodynamics, and my counterpart, Beacon Lead for Transport Technology. And over that panel for 15 or 20 minutes, we'll offer some reflection, debates and some discussion between our internal staff here and our two guests. Before opening out for questions and observations from the audience. And finally, obviously, we will finish up and then go and have some food and some drink. So, Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Annamarie Phelps. Annamarie is an Olympic rower who represented Great Britain at the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. She's currently Vice Chair of the British Olympic Association, having been former Chairman of the British Rowing and Vice Chair of the British Paralympic Association, helping to steer both of those latter organisations through considerable change in structure and governance. She's a member of the European Rowing Board of Management, Director of the Head of the Charles Regatta, and Commonwealth Liaison to FISA, which is the International Federation for Rowing. Annamarie chaired the Cycling Independent Review Panel into the culture and climate of British cycling's high-performance programmes and supported the DCMF's Duty of Care in Sport Review led by Tanya Gray-Thompson in 2017. As Deputy Chair in Rowing, British Rowing until 2013, she implemented safeguarding, anti-doping governance and equality policies. Now, in another life, Annamarie specialises in British 19th and 20th century decorative arts, post-war textile design and contemporary craft, a consultant, curator, editor and author, a woman of many talents. Annamarie will be speaking, as you can see, on the changing landscape of sport and its need to focus on innovation and change and to identify new types of leadership and values. So, Annamarie, welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to, just in case you've missed that, I'm going to start with a short video first, just because I think we all need to be a little bit energised and remember the sport bit of what I do before I talk to you about sport governance, which is always overboard. Plenty of motion and plenty of emotion, I think, in rowing, and if you hadn't guessed I was a rower then before now, then that might have sealed it. We like to think we do things differently in rowing. We like to go forwards by sitting backwards, and our front of our boat is the back of our boat. People talk about pulling on an oar, but we don't. We push the boat past the oar. In Olympic terms, it's an individual sport, but most people row as a crew, which is clearly a team. And whilst everyone in the crew does the same thing, each crew member has a very defined role. So we're a bit different. We tend to think a bit differently. I hope you can unpick some of my thoughts as we go through this evening's talk. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, and actually, Vice Chancellor, I'm delighted that you're a geographer, as I am a geographer. And I will refer to that in a little bit. But I'm a geographer that assiduously avoided anything in ology and anything to do with maths. So meteorology, glaciology, geology, we're all somewhere over there. I largely stuck to the historical, the human and the social sciences, and then went on to study art and design. So I was slightly relieved when Vicky and Chris promised me that they were very happy I didn't touch on engineering and sciences. So what I'm going to talk to you about is a little bit more about sport and governance, and ensuring that neither are set in stone, but that they are mobile and progressive, agile and fit for the future. They're in motion, but they're stable. And I want to do it just by telling you a little bit about my journey, because as a geographer and art historian, the past, for me, is key to the present. So we need to look at what sport looks like today, and perhaps why it's the way it is. And, importantly, how it needs to change to a more diverse and less risk-averse model if it's really to thrive. So I was born in North London and schooled in Hertfordshire. I managed to get into Cambridge by the skin of my teeth, and I mean that quite literally. And after a disastrous set of first-year exam results, I was dispatched to the river by my rather enlightened tutor to take up rowing. And it was a high-risk strategy, but it was one that was designed to keep me out of the bar, I think, to add some structure and discipline to my life. My sporting life had been a bit odd at secondary school. I went to a girls' school, convent school, and our headmistress, who was a nun, really wasn't very keen. She thought sport was hugely unladylike. We were not allowed to watch others compete in sports day in case we were encouraged to clap or cheer or do anything quite so unladylike. And when we went out to do sport, we had to wear glow shirts because she felt that horses sweat, men perspire, and ladies were to glow. And so no sweatshirts, glow shirts. So from a very early age, I'd seen sports across all sorts of inside and out, I guess, on terraces, at Loftus Road from the 1970s onwards, and in my early years watching my dad play on a Sunday morning football match. I was a reluctant schoolgirl in sport because it wasn't cool, and then through university, a late enthusiastic convert. And you know how converts are generally speaking the most zealous of advocates. So in between training for my GB trials, I worked as an antiques dealer, specialising in a tiny bit of British design history, and pulling together the evidence and setting out forgotten stories of chairs and textiles and tables was what I really loved to do. And then I cycled off to lift weights and immerse myself in my sporting dreams. I've been really blessed throughout my sporting career with amazing support from coaches and peers and from parents and mentors. And making the Olympic team, I think I was probably more surprised than anyone else. But at no point would I have guessed that my longer lasting contribution to rowing would be in the sports governance side rather than as an athlete. But it was recognised by my coach, by my cruise sponsor, and by the president of the federation, the late Dame Di Ellis, all of whom, before I really understood and appreciated the implications, encouraged, cajoled, and elbowed me to take on roles, both within our NGB, the NPC, and the NOC. Often they were roles where I felt, to be quite honest, uncomfortable, unprepared, and underqualified. I was delegated responsibilities which I took on with fear, but always with support and guidance and a safety net. I learnt about every aspect of my sport. And what was important for me then, I think, as it is now, and for many women particularly, was that I was able to meaningfully contribute and to make a difference in many of those areas. So I'm just going to hop back to my geography degree. Landscape, environment, and ecosystems. Three areas of sort of geographic terminology, I guess, which apply, I think, across almost any sector you choose. We use the first two, landscape and environment, a huge amount in sport, and increasingly in recent years. Media, government, even sport itself talks about the sports landscape, the leadership landscape. We talk about the high-performance environment. The landscape, what we can see, is just like the crust of the earth. The landscape in sport, knowing it and describing it is of no use at all if we can't understand what shaped it and what continues to shape it. We need to understand that it's a moving and changing picture, influenced by intrinsic as well as external forces and processes. And the environment, the sports environment, in many ways is key. It's that bit that we experience in the sports world every day in our day-to-day lives. The behaviours and the attitudes of those around us that help us to perform and deliver. It's become rather overused now, but the word culture fits, but I think we use it a little bit too much. So true sustainable change requires more than just a surface shift. It means that those in sport need to keep their feelers out internally, as well as keeping their heads up to look over the horizon. And the key to a sustainable sports sector, as with any ecosystem, is going to be able to continually respond to what's happening across not just our sector of sport, but those we overlap with. If we deny our ecosystem just one essential ingredient, it'll set off a chain reaction. Every small change will have an impact somewhere else. These may be large or small. They may be beneficial, benign, or detrimental. Changes trigger other changes in order to rebalance the system and ensure it can function in a sustainable way. Sport, as a system, needs to be constantly in motion. It needs to react proactively to progress for its own survival, and to react reactively to absorb negative shocks, external influences, and collateral damage that threatens its existence. So what does the sports landscape look like today? It doesn't look very happy. We've had extended media storm of scandals, bullying, harassment claims, disputes over the classification of para-athletes, child abuse, doping cases, fraud, match-fixing allegations, you name it. It goes on. Despite all this, people involved in sport just love it. The vast, vast majority get involved because they believe in its amazing powers. They love what it's done for them and how it can help others. And for some, it's a religion almost. And remember, I'm a convert at this point. There is an almost universal acceptance that sport, exercise, and the skills and experiences it brings are good. More than good. They're desirable and increasingly essential. We need a healthy, fit population to lower the cost of health provision, to support the development of leaders for industry, politics, academia, and ethics. And if we're to make sport and exercise attractive to all, inclusive and successful, and to provide a performance pathway for the tiny majority that compete at world level, but who bring national pride at key moments, then we need to be constantly rebalancing the system for future generations. Alongside huge investment in the UK has come increased scrutiny by the media and by government. And sport has been forced to be publicly accountable. Rightly so. As Paddy Havison, who's a communications and crisis expert, said at the Leaders' Conference this week, sport has a moral responsibility to be transparent and to do the right thing. This in itself adds pressure onto the sector. If we look around now, it would appear that sport has become inhabited by some really murky characters. In sport, as across all society, there are people prone to lie and to cheat, people who relish power and don't know when to stand away, people who are greedy, even criminal. There are paedophiles, abusers, fraudsters, people who take advantage of sport's inflexibility and naivety for their own benefit and pleasure. And weeding them out is not helped by the concentration of power and the self-perpetuating groupthink of many international and some national sports organisations who dig in moments of crisis. It's extraordinary how people under scrutiny in crisis can make some very strange decisions. Without the will or the ability to change and to listen to alternative views, people stop questioning decisions and one another. And the result is ignorance, navel-gazing, oversight, poor governance, if we're lucky. At its worst, the concentration of power can be corrupt. Think about FIFA and the IAAF. And once it sets in, it's not easy to go about trying to sort it out. Think about the miles, the hard graft, the schmoozing and the politics that Seb Coe had to put in to do what seemed like an obvious rewrite of the International Federation rules and statutes just to make them fit for the modern world. How many other sports have yet to follow that? Let me just quickly go back to my ecosystem idea. I think sport sits rather uncomfortably between sectors, teetering between and impacted by a number of industries and stakeholders. On the positive side, it sits astride many of the key sectors for health, well-being, for the success of our nation, and for the world's population. Sport is a competitive pastime, an educational tool, a huge trading and entertainment business. And those of us in sport like to think of it as a tool for social inclusion and social mobility. But changes in policy, in funding and objectives of any of these sectors can cause welcome or unwelcome need for a rebalance across the sport, either globally or in our own local area. Sport was just not designed to fit across so many sectors. nor to produce such diverse and complex outcomes. Almost every sport was designed and codified to provide competition, morally acceptable competition that replaced warring between like-minded men and with them in mind. Spectator interest was largely through wages and not because it was a great spectator sport. But sport is now huge business. It's reliant on spectators and merchandising, on broadcast and sponsors. Even non-commercial amateur sport needs to create revenue to survive. Not just football and rugby. All our governing bodies now have to look at commercialising just to stand still. The expectations of constant improvement and growth adds pressure on management, on staff, and on athletes, and especially on our coaches. I did wonder whether there's a whole new industry of expectation management out there to be developed. Football has to some extent accepted its fate. The chairman of FC Inter Milan announced this week that it's preparing for a transition. No longer will Inter Milan be a family football club. They're moving to a multinational entertainment and media business. Their content is sport, football. Their business is media. Look at Fulham Football Club's billionaire owner, Shahid Khan, currently trying to buy our national football stadium in which to promote his NFL team, the Jacksonville Jaguars. We're very slow to change. It's a fact that almost every British football fan out there believes that they still own their club. The owners are just mere guardians for the next period. But that's certainly not the case in law. The change is fast-paced. The entertainment business that sport is rapidly being sucked into is in turn influenced by digital technology. At a conference earlier this week, Facebook's Peter Hutton admitted that doing a 3-year projection of their business in such a fast-changing media world is almost impossible. Nobody knows what technology they'll be using in 3 years' time. He talked about the demand for data from wearable technologies to be available on demand during competitions being live streamed. Technology may well be able to deliver that. But are we ready? Are the coaches ready? The athletes? Are there ethical considerations about live streaming a player's heart rate, their protein consumption, their respiratory rate, while he or she is playing? Sport isn't where it was. It's been through some pretty seismic changes, and it's feeling the impact. Apart from the bad news on the front pages and back pages, there's so much happening. But sport needs to keep its head up and stay agile, keep an eye on what's ahead, and particularly to set its own course. Sport reflects society and follows society. And sport, like society, has evolved, but very slowly. Perhaps it's been its structure, its historic societal makeup. Perhaps it's the power being invested in such small areas and groups. Too often its leadership in the past has been conferred for long service, rather than because someone has the skills for the future of the business. Invested interest can consciously or subconsciously protect from change until things are pushed to a tipping point. Think about the rise of welfare concerns for athletes. Look at NASA and US gymnastics, Barry Bonnell and the FA. Even the publication of the IOC's Agenda 2020 and the new norm, ostensibly to make the Games more attractive to bidding cities, has a sense of crisis about it. Exposure of corruption in FIFA. In the UK, in the lead up to Rio, we had a number of disclosures by athletes of very disturbing behaviours by senior coaches and officials. I wonder in how many cases this was due to underlying factors, to poor treatment of staff, to pressure to deliver KPIs year on year, driven by an intense focus on achieving outcomes to the detriment, potentially, and of the well-being of both staff and athletes, all of which could and should have been detected and addressed earlier. Why is it that sport hasn't been more open to new ideas and on the front foot? On the performance on the field of play? Sport is desperate for data, for new ideas and for innovation. Many of the key tipping points have been promoted and pushed by the women's sport movement for many years. I wonder if it's any coincidence that some of these things have come to the fore at a time when women's influence in sport has never been greater. Apologies to you, any of you who've heard me speak before. This is one of my favourite slides, I'm afraid. This article was published in The Guardian in 1985, when the sprint for fair play turned into an obstacle race, and it was written by John Cunningham. Peter Lawson, from whom these quotes come, was the General Secretary of the CCPR, now the Sport and Recreation Alliance, UK's independent body that represented all sports and recreation organisations. I guess what was striking to me when I read this was that it was only 30 years ago, so it's like yesterday. But it's the sporting world that I grew up in. 1985 is the year I started rowing, when I was at university. And the other thing that occurs to me is that if I grew up with these negative attitudes about women's sports, so did all my male peers. The generation of sports leaders, now in their late 40s and their early 50s, grew up in a sporting environment where women were not seen or heard, on the pitches, in the changing rooms, or in the clubhouse. This attitude is not one random misogynistic male. It is baked into the system of sport since the 19th century, possibly since ancient Greece. The self-perpetuating system of sport values and systems has been built around a notion that sport is about recognising the alpha male. In a system based on military structure and values, sport rewards and celebrates the highest, the strongest, the fastest. The hero, the victor, the leader. Females, frankly, are out of the frame. Sport historically has been led and designed around a system that favours traits that are typically, though not exclusively, male, and outcomes where females just cannot compete. If what is important is to be the fastest, the highest, and the strongest, women will only ever be second best. Genetically, they're disadvantaged from the outset. And we still look to Olympic champions and World Cup winners to lead sport. People hang off their words. They guide thinking about sport, as military leaders in many parts of the world lead and guide politics and culture. Of course, things have changed and are moving, but how deep are the changes in reality? Adding a few women to a board to meet quotas won't support a sufficient directional change, won't potentially challenge conventional views. Is it any surprise in many ways that we're still talking about gender and diversity, rather than seeing meaningful change in the sports environment? The answer is not merely to drop in women who develop the skills to fit into this model of sports governance. And it's not just women. Anyone who's done simple team-building experiments will know that the diverse team is the best. The team that thinks laterally about problem solving. And if you want a good business case, of course, diverse boards are simply more profitable. Whilst on the field of play and in the gym, sport hankers for more and more information, more data, more insight. But in its committee rooms and governance structures, it has stood still for decades, centuries even, plastering over cracks and often in the past sweeping crises under the carpet. We need sport to ensure that we allow women and men to be themselves, whatever combination of characteristics and background they have. Everyone has something to offer. We need to celebrate diversity, acknowledge and understand the complexity of intersectionality, and acknowledge overlapping systems of disadvantage and discrimination that it can bring. We need to seek out those that are underrepresented and empower them to be the people they are, accepted and welcomed into a sporting family that can accommodate their needs and values at all levels. In the future, sport will be even more complex than it is now. Part entertainment, part competition, a leisure pursuit, a corporate sector, an obsession. Medicine for physical and mental health, and an antidote for obesity, a way to bring generations together. Moving to an inclusive sporting system that prioritises cohesive, sustainable and dynamic communities at all levels is the future. And so we need to be agile and we need to move faster than in the last 30 years. And most importantly, sport needs to avoid a linear way of working. Change and agility need to be on many levels, drawing from many experiences, trying many initiatives, and talking differently with different people. And there's one assumption that we must avoid at all costs, and that is that those outside the system need help to fit into it. Those who are underrepresented at the moment don't need to change. We need the diversity that they bring. We need to make a shift in the groupthink of sport and sports clubs and organisations. I just want to finish with one last slide to encourage you to be disruptors, not just of your science or your engineering department, but of society. So be unreasonable, be yourself, and bring yourself to the debate. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to Annamarie. So we move to our second speaker of the evening, Sarah-Jayne Williams. Sarah-Jayne is Director of Smart Mobility at Ford Europe. She was appointed to this role in 2017, having previously worked at Bearing Point, a global business consulting firm where she was a partner in the automotive team and led the company-wide Connected Car Centre of Excellence. She has worked with OEMs, which are original equipment manufacturers, which is something I learned the first time this weekend, and automotive leasing providers to design and deliver new business models, digital strategies and connected car services. Sarah-Jayne is the lead for the Ford of Europe Professional Women's Network and an active leader in diversity programmes. She established the Bearing Point Foundation, channeling Bearing Point's corporate social responsibility activities. And prior to joining the consulting industry, she worked for Motorola, leading its business and technology transformation programs. Sarah-Jayne has published work on connected cars, data privacy, digital customer behaviours, world-class digital organisations, and co-authored the book Customer Paradoxes in the Digital World. She's also a past winner of the Management Consulting Association Award for Marketing Consultant of the Year and a joint team winner with Jaguar Land Rover for the 2015 Management Consulting Association Digital and Technology Project of the Year for Connected Car. In her spare time, we have spare time, Sarah-Jayne enjoys hiking, sea kayaking and adventure racing. As you can see, Sarah-Jayne will be speaking on mobility reimagined and what this means for the automotive industry. Sarah-Jayne, welcome to Loughborough.
Thanks very much. It's quite strange when you hear your life history told in that way. It doesn't sound quite so exciting when you live it, I have to say. So I got I think probably the short straw in going second in this. So I have to think very carefully through all the really inspirational things Annamarie said and try and draw some of the links to what's happening in the automotive world. But we also face an unprecedented time of change in movement, moving people and moving goods, very much so in urban areas. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about how we are reimagining the future for mobility. This advert appeared in the 1920s in an American newspaper. And at the time, it really summed up our first imagination of what mobility could be. Henry Ford very much had a vision that talked about if people have freedom of movement, it will drive human progress. And his thinking around that was if people have access to move, to get jobs, to get healthcare, to get schooling and education, to form communities, that actually it will accelerate human progress. And the vision that he set out was really about opening the highways to all mankind. And in some very small text, somewhere down here, you can see that there was a line in this advert that talks about Ford having a pride in great achievement with the sincere and sober realization of new and larger opportunities for service to mankind. It sounds like a very noble cause for what is a commercial business. But what's interesting is, from the kind of original vision that Henry Ford had, despite the fact that we've managed to continue to provide vehicles, the world that we've provided vehicles into has kept changing. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with these key trends, but one of our biggest challenges is that by the middle of this century, about 70% of the world's population will live within an urban environment within a city. And those of us that commute into cities on a regular basis will know that the infrastructure today struggles to handle that, especially if there's a bit of rain, a bit of leaves or wind or snow. But really, we're already challenged. And in London, in the next kind of 10, 15 years, there'll be about 7 million new journeys a day that will be required to support the movement of people into cities. Another trend which we're seeing in developing countries is that there's a new affordability. There's a new middle class that want to own and buy vehicles. They want to have vehicles that operate within a city environment. We also see significant challenges in air quality. There's the formal, the kind of European Union or European Commission tariffs and fines that they're putting on cities for breaching the emissions limits. But what you also see, which is much more powerful in many ways, is the press really building on a kind of a human emotion about fear to do with the health consequences of air quality. You have Doctors Against Diesel, you have reports talking about harm to unborn babies, to our health throughout life, to children. And it's really creating a shift in how people are viewing the challenge in cities with air quality. And then the other global trend that we see is this change around how we as consumers access or own different types of services. Hands up who had an LP or a record collection. Keep your hands up. Who had a CD collection? Tape collection? Cassette collection? Hands up who no longer has a tape, CD or record collection. Oh, it's not that many. That's interesting. I'm one of those who have certainly become the generation, I have online content, I subscribe to music services, I subscribe to film services. What's helpful for me is my house isn't full of clutter. I convinced my husband in our early years of marriage to get rid of his record collection, which I'm not sure he's forgiven me for yet. But I can access music and content and films wherever I want to without having to own the assets themselves, without having to worry about looking after them or placing them or find homes for them in my already cluttered house. And that kind of mentality around access versus ownership is one that's also changing people's views around ownership of vehicles. Vehicles bring cost, they require attention, they require looking after, they require somewhere to store or park. And what we're finding is increasingly, particularly in urban environments, actually the cost and the effort of owning a vehicle actually is too high, and people would prefer to have access to mobility services, so access to use transportation or mobility at their convenience rather than having to own types of mobility. And this is all happening at a time when we have better connectivity than ever before. Still not great. Your phone still drops when you drive up the motorway, as I discovered this morning. But overall, we're able to connect. We can actually get an Uber on demand most of the time. You can get services on demand from a smartphone, which is changing how people consume mobility. So if you think about these different trends and working for a car company, there's a few challenges for us to face. One of the observations that we've kind of spent quite a lot of time thinking about is, obviously we imagined mobility the first time from a horse to a car. We've continued to improve the car. The cars they're safer, they're faster, they're cleaner. I think they're better looking sometimes, most of the time. And we've continued to invest lots of money to develop and to produce newer, better models. But actually at the same time, the actual gap between the needs that people have is actually kind of got worse. Because if you try and drive a Porsche 911 or a Ford Mustang or any other fast vehicle in a city environment, you're generally still going to sit in traffic for a very, very long time. It actually doesn't help you having a faster vehicle. So what we're seeing is, actually, although we've got better vehicles, the infrastructure and the environment that we operate in actually doesn't allow us to optimize and to use those vehicles. So we have a gap in the design that we've built. Back in 2011, Bill Ford, who's the chairman of Ford Motor Company, descendant of Henry Ford, it's still a family-owned company, gave what was an incredibly bold TED Talk. It was actually one of the inspirations for me personally to join Ford Motor Company. And as the chairman of a car company, he basically said, what mobility is today, the model that we have is not going to work in the future. If every person wants to continue to have a privately owned vehicle that they want to drive, particularly in cities, we're going to reach what he termed global gridlock. And if anyone has visited, any of the most congested cities in the world, whether it's Moscow, Beijing, and spent hours, kind of sitting in some of the traffic, you'll have begun to experience what that global gridlock can feel like. And it certainly doesn't feel like the freedom of movement that Henry Ford talked about many years beforehand. And so back in 2011, Bill Ford made this comment that actually, our mobility model is not going to work for the future. We need smart cars, we need smart parking, we need smart roads, and we need smart public transportation systems. And this very much shapes what we do now within smart mobility in Ford of Europe. We have a significant shift. So, for many years as a car company, we've focused on building a product and getting that product out to market, a good product, a cool product, products that customers love. But what we now have to think about is really Annamarie's term, the ecosystem, or the system that that vehicle goes out into. Every time we launch a vehicle, it's going to operate in a world where there's a specific geography, where there's specific infrastructure, and particularly in Europe. If you compare the European cities to North American cities, our cities were generally built around churches, around trade, around people. They weren't built for vehicles. And now, as we begin to think about what mobility looks like, we're actually thinking about, what does the different layers in the system look like? What constraints are there, and how should movement actually operate within them? Within that, there's vehicles. There's also lots of other objects moving around cities. There's people. There's bikes. There's increasingly multiple modes of transport, and we now have connected vehicles, which is beginning to drive a significant change for how we move vehicles. And then on top of that, we can then begin to think about services and what types of services actually will help people and goods move in an efficient way. So from once upon a time, just thinking about our vehicle, we're now thinking about the system. Annamarie talked about the fact that sport wasn't designed for kind of the world it operates in now. In many ways, kind of the car wasn't really designed for the world it operates in now. It was designed for the open highway. It wasn't designed for these very congested city centres that we operate in. So as a car company, we're now thinking not just about the car, but also about the environment, the ecosystem that car has to operate in, and also about other ways of moving both people and goods around cities. For us as citizens, that world is also changing. How we get from A to B. If any of you remember back to the A to Zs. This was a number of years ago. If you were driving into a city, or if you were going to a city, generally you would start with your vehicle. You'd get your A to Z. You'd probably have an argument with whoever's your passenger and doing the navigation to work out what the best route was through the city. Following an A to Z was never easy, and I'm a pretty good map reader, but it's never easy. And it basically was a very manual process that you, as the user, chose what route you were going to go. We then had the birth of the TomTom. That was my first sat-nav. It was a very exciting day when I suddenly got this kind of digital display to see the best way to go. So you didn't actually have to argue over the map. You could actually blame a system or a voice, usually a woman's voice, interestingly, about which was the best route to take. Over time, that's matured quite a lot. So if I'm going into a city now, I can go on one of the many kind of journey planner apps, and I can start to think about what's the best way for me to go in. I could drive, or I could take a combination of public transportation, or I could take a bike, or I could take a train, whatever it is. And I can compare which is the best route to go. And what's interesting is even today, if you have two phones, open up Google Maps or Apple Maps, or whichever chosen map provider you use. Those ones I do know that works, other ones might not. If you go search to a journey to two of the same locations on two different devices, most of the time you'll get a different response, because already there's algorithms built in to smooth out the kind of demand for different routes. So it gets quite frustrating. You think you're trusting something, but already you're actually kind of almost being nudged as to which route the system would like you to take. So we kind of moved into this multimodal world. Kind of where we are now is kind of the beginning of a very different phase in mobility. And this is, firstly, we're seeing the types of modes exploding. So, whether it's, ride-hailing or car sharing or peer-to-peer car sharing, whether it's e-bikes, e-scooters, not that we're allowed them in the UK yet, but we will, I'm sure. All these different new modes of transport. But also, what we're moving towards is almost like a kind of an air traffic control for mobility. So if you imagine, how airplanes navigate through the skies, you're basically kind of, every plane is known, the data about every plane, where it's come from, where it's going, where it lands, exactly what parking space, not sure that's a technical term, but where it's going is all pre-planned, and it's communicated to the plane and to the pilot. In a future world of mobility, one of our biggest considerations is really around what this kind of system-optimized view is, how that system actually gets managed. So tenuous link back to the previous presentation, the governance over all of our mobility is going to increasingly change. Another shift is a fairly significant one, which actually, the inspiration for this, interestingly, didn't actually start in the car industry. I think it might be the challenge of kind of reimagining kind of having a faster horse. We didn't reimagine taking out drivers and going to autonomous vehicles. This actually started in the US defense industry, and it was thinking about how do you actually protect soldiers' lives on the battlefield. Warfare had got increasingly complex. It's kind of back in kind of early 2000s, and DARPA, which is the kind of advanced research wing of the US Defense team, set out this challenge to create a self-driving, autonomous vehicle with a focus on the battlefield. The first trial or test or competition they did failed. It was to drive across the Mojave Desert. The second one, in 2007, the famous Urban Challenge, actually had a number of winners. And the vehicles that were used back in 2007 had sensors, they had cameras, they had LiDARs, and they had connectivity. And it very much kind of gave birth to the inspiration that Ford and many other car companies are now working on to change the future of mobility once again and reimagine what that looks like. What's interesting is DARPA, who kind of set up this challenge, they also were responsible for one of the significant innovations that we all use on a daily basis at least, which is the internet. So they started out on a project which was to connect computers across a network. They developed something called ARPANET. And that, over time, has become the internet and something that has completely transformed our world, from how we communicate, how we trade, how we interact, how the globe actually connects and works. And what's interesting, both of these are kind of accidental innovations that have changed the world. And I think, we very much see autonomous vehicles as really transforming mobility for the future. Our initial expectation around autonomous vehicles is not that you and I will all own one and go and sit in it, sleep in it, live in it, drive around cities, or sit in gridlock in cities. But it's actually that these will be shared transportation for both people and goods. So it will be a service, which will ultimately, if you can encourage people to share transportation, it reduces the number of vehicles on the road, which then reduces the impact on congestion and on air quality. So this is kind of where we're going from a future perspective. And we see these vehicles very much beginning to operate in an overall system. And again, this, I guess, comes back to this air traffic control piece, where the starting place is to optimize this whole system, we need data. Pretty much the live streaming of heart data, not quite that level, but we need data about where people are going, why they want to go there, data from vehicles, where they're going, data from sensors about the infrastructure, what's happening. Using that data to actually model and simulate, using machine learning, using artificial intelligence to work out how to better optimize how the supply of mobility methods or modes actually meets the demand of people that want them. Then being able to we call it orchestrate, or kind of manage or influence how people make journeys, and then ultimately communicating it back. It could be communicating back to your autonomous vehicle to say, this is the route that you go. It could be communicating to you through your Google map or your city map or journey planner or whatever it is. But actually an overall system changing how we operate and move within a city environment. At Ford, our strategy today actually very much feeds back to Bill Ford's comments back in 2011 about we need smart cars and we need smart parking, and ultimately we need a smart world. And our mobility strategy is really about building smart vehicles to operate in a smart world. And we are working both on the smart vehicles to create a connected experience, connecting up our vehicles so that they connect with the infrastructure, they connect with other vehicles, they connect with people to be able to operate in a smart world. And in the smart world, we're looking at solutions that help people share vehicles rather than be dependent on their own vehicle. And that is really about changing behavior. What is it that encourages you to get out of your comfortable privately owned car where no one's sneezing next to you, into shared transportation, and how do you make that happen? To also thinking about, how do we help people find parking faster so they're not circling? How do we help goods move better around cities? So these are all the areas that we're exploring as part of thinking about the future of mobility. Actually, before I move on, underpinning our vision around smart vehicles in a smart world, we have something which we've called the Transportation Mobility Cloud, which is really a data cloud to bring together data from vehicles with data from cities to enable that optimization of the whole system that I showed on the previous slide. And I'm going to hopefully very quickly show you a video, if we can make this work, because mine wasn't quite as straightforward. So hopefully that's given you a taster of what a kind of a future can look like when we bring together data from one mode, that's just one mode of transport, and that's a very few number of vehicles, with data from cities, to begin to think about how you optimize and how you change and transform our whole mobility system. And it sounds a bit cheesy, but kind of for the greater good. This whole change is really from a satisfying the needs of an individual to actually making a city work for all of us. Another slightly cheesy picture. But I'll end with this one. There's lots of different pictures that are painted of kind of the city of tomorrow, the future city. Some things, we know there'll be multiple modes of transport. We know that there'll be shared transportation. We know there'll be cleaner transportation. But what we do know is that key to these changes is going to be human cooperation, system cooperation, and collaboration across all different types of organizations. It's companies like Ford, It's working with our competitors, it's working with startups, it's working with governments, it's working with cities, and it's working with academia. These challenges that cities are facing are huge. Redesigning the infrastructure, redesigning how people move is a significant challenge. And it's why I'm really delighted to be here, because you guys are key to helping us work this out together. So thank you very much for inviting us here this evening, and I hope you've found the insights useful. Thank you.
So what we thought we might do just for 10 or 15 minutes before Q&As is just to get some reflection, observations, some discussion going based upon the content of our two speakers' presentations. Then maybe open out to the audience as well to get some reflections and Q&A. But I'd like to probably first open up to Martin first in terms of any kind of reflections, observations you have of the presentation, but also linking in maybe to West, where it might fit in as well.
Okay. Two fantastic talks, actually. I really enjoyed them. I think one of the things that really strikes me about the things that I've heard today is that both of these things are in this moment of really quite dramatic change. But I'm not sure I see quite how it's going to happen. I don't think anybody does really, actually. So for me, I think there's a big part for government to play, actually. Government, maybe for the mobility aspects, but governing bodies for sport. Because it seems to me people are very reluctant to change without maybe a little bit more than a nudge, actually. I don't want to get out of my car. I'm entirely selfish about the whole business myself as well, actually. So I'm interested to know what people think about how this will really materialise, actually, because in cities we need to get really very many people off the road, not just a few of them, I think, actually. So I think for me that's interesting, and I also think that if you have to drive stuff through legislation, then that can kind of also push you down potentially quite a narrow path. So how does a company like Ford and a sports body who are interested in competition, both of them in fact, because to make money or to win competitions, how do you make sure that still happens? How do we get there from here? It seems to be quite a difficult question, actually.
Sure. Where do I start? I guess just to agree, I think the pace of change, one of it is common in both of our presentations. In the mobility world, is astounding. If you actually look at some of the changes already, it took Uber about 3 years to reach the same number of journeys that has taken an e-scooter company. So it took 3 years to reach the same number of journeys that an e-scooter company has done in months. And this is the pace of change of growth of some of these new ways of moving around cities. The legislation doesn't keep up, as I said in my slightly disappointed comment, is that in the UK you can't use e-scooters yet. Obviously in other countries and cities that you can do. So I think legislation has a role to play in helping shape and change the future of mobility. I think your comment around competition, we've, I think, been quite clear around we want to make a positive difference to communities and to the world we work in. But we also have to build a profitable business. That is part of what makes us a company and able to employ people and keep progressing for the future. And we will be working in an ecosystem with other players that also need to be competitive and manage a future business. And I think the lines in the sand are still being drawn. I don't think anyone really knows how it's going to play out at this point in time. I think one of the things that we are very clear on is that as consumers typically now, we are interested in experiences. We care less about brand and care less of, our egos are not necessarily as affirmed by some of the things that we own. It's actually the experiences that matter. So I think we very much are focusing on how to bring design thinking and human centered into everything that we're doing, so that we can create experiences that people actually want to consume and want to have. And that's, I guess, the way that we see we'll compete in the future. It's less about the best engine or the best this, the best that. It's actually about the experience that you create. I hope I think touched on a number of points. I hope that covers
Well, I think, yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that interests me actually, and Bob was whispering to me while somebody was talking earlier actually, is that actually people still buy cars and they choose their cars. It seems to me that they still choose cars on the basis of status and their position, and I wonder how we really get to a position where people are prepared to share. Because they have to share the space, but you're talking about them sharing cars and maybe someone sitting beside them and sneezing and whatever else.
I mean, the stats already show the changes. Car ownership is declining, and particularly in an urban environment, car ownership is declining. Car sharing is exploding. The number of new mobility schemes that enable movement are growing and are becoming profitable on a regular basis. So, I don't necessarily think it's all people of a certain generation that are shifting. I think there's a life stage aspect to that. Sharing a car if you've got 3 young children and a dog is very different to if you're an independent person with attachments and worries to have to deal with. So I think we will continue to see the evolution, but quite frankly, if everybody does continue to sit in the vehicle, no one's going to move. So something has to give. And if you can redesign an experience that makes shared mobility much more comfortable, the commuter sharing service that we've launched, Chariot, you pre-book a seat, you have Wi-Fi, you have power, you have your own seat, you've got guaranteed space for your luggage, and so that kind of the experience of shared transportation where you're kind of don't know if you're going to get seats, what you're kind of stuck in someone else's armpit, all those horrible things. Actually, if you can change that, then it encourages people more easily to switch, and actually it can become productive time. And I think particularly if you operate in an urban environment, that's very important.
Yeah.
Can I ask about the way you see, obviously, the interface between sport and transport technology probably best lies in terms of health and physical activity of humans, and the sense that with the availability of so much data, in sport athletes like data from wearable technologies because it's motivating or because the feedback allows people to set goals, etc., in terms of their exercise and other parameters. But to what degree do you see that being integrated into a connected car, whereby you would have a person in the car who, and the system would maybe pick the best car park, but then say, actually, if you walk from here, you'll burn 120 calories, which is one finger of Twix. And if you walk from here and you do that 5 times a week, then that also leads to this reward on your health insurance premium, and you begin to sort of nudge and change the motivation of a human through a car because of the data, information, and feedback that someone is getting from the vehicle and the choices they make to then do the car park and then walk to work from that. Across the board.
I mean, certainly, and I think for us, the problem actually isn't the car. You start to plan your journey when you're at home, so actually it's probably going to be in an app that we use. And, in some ways, although we've seen significant development in journey planning, it is still quite dumb. I'm permanently doing multiple searches to try and manage complex journeys. I want to drive to a certain point, then I want to make sure I take public transportation, then I want to make sure I'm on public transportation with a seat, or I want to make sure that actually I can have a walk at the end of it, or actually I want to have a cycle at the end of it. And I've got all these kind of personal aspirations and needs from my journey that differ for everyone. Sometimes people want the fastest, sometimes people want the cheapest, sometimes people want to actually burn calories while they're doing part of their journey. And I think as we see the maturity of these journey planning solutions evolve, actually being able to say, the best thing for you is actually to drive to that station where we keep up the space for you. You then get trained to that point, you then get off, you transition onto a bike or an e-bike, whatever's best, and then you walk your last 15 minutes. And in that way, you've achieved your goal of cost, you've achieved your goals of active transport and whatever else it is that you personally want to do. So I certainly think that will come in that kind of bringing together the system where this sits together.
It's quite interesting. I still think though that by adapting cars around people, you're not actually resolving the root problem, which is the fact that the city just wasn't built for the modern day. So at what point do you say actually you need to, controversially perhaps, just knock down vast tracts of the city and make them more able for people to move around? Or redesign buildings. I mean, there's an awful lot of buildings in the middle of London that are pretty new. They've all been built in the last 10 years. How do you start to look at those sorts of things as part of the transportation system? Because a bit, if you look at sport, what it's done is it's tried to sort of fit around different things. We've got the code of governance and it sticks a few people in here, adds a bit of diversity there, or whatever. Not actually resolving the core problem, which is, was sport really designed for what we're using it for now? So I just wonder whether we need to be a bit more, even more radical, rather than sort of tweaking our cars and our transportation systems, rethink the public transport system from scratch. What is what's the answer?
That's right. We kind of focus on taking back the streets to people. Actually, if you go back to the original photos of the streets, you would see bikes and lots of carriages and horses and people and trade and everything happening in the streets. And our vision is actually to help get back to a place where people can own the streets. I had my first ever trip to Venice a couple of weekends ago and experienced a city with no cars. And it's phenomenal. I work in a car company, but my goodness, I'd love to live in a city with no cars. But I also need to get from A to B. So I'm really excited about the thought, finding alternative ways to help people move and active transport, walking, cycling, scooting, riding, whatever it is a key part of that. And the side benefits, as you talked about, in terms of the impact on overall well-being and the impact on the healthcare system and everything is there. So for us, I think our city's generally pretty beautiful. I think we need to start that change. But as we develop new buildings and new things, bring up new areas or greenfield sites, whatever, and greyfield sites, it's actually about how do you build in the thinking around shared transportation hubs to actually enable you to transition between modes of transport that will change the future. You always start loving this. Not simple. There's a few buildings I choose first. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yes, my observation, just trying to take some synergies from both presentations really, was I can see gridlock on the roads, I can see gridlock parking. At the moment, I guess my question to Annamarie is almost along the lines of, where and when do you see gridlock in sport? We can see pockets of it, but like you say, I can see a strategy to try and minimise some of that. But I'm just wondering, is the gridlock eventually going to be into the lack of technologies, knowledge, and drawing the other space notes in terms of we talk about access or ownership, manage or influence. And your experience of being an athlete, you've been coached, but also you now see the coaches. So I'm just wondering, how far is gridlock in sport?
I think there's probably different levels on which we're talking. So I think we've seen gridlock, and I think some of those sort of tipping points at which you get a crisis within the sports organisations is eventually gridlock. That sort of refusal to move, total refusal to accept that there's something going wrong in your organisation, and suddenly crisis hits is one way of doing it. But I think that there are other potential gridlocks which probably don't look like a traffic gridlock, but what happens if football continues to grow at the rate it's growing? We end up. I was at a talk earlier last week, and the chairman of Chelsea Football Club was saying, there are 12 football clubs in Europe that are going to remain the top 12 football clubs. They will just remain up there, getting stronger and stronger, and there will be a gap between those clubs in their Premier Leagues in their respective countries and the clubs that are trying to get up and be promoted into that league. And because of the way the system works, there's never going to be progress, they're never going to catch up. And I see there being some sports, football, definitely like that. You know, the sports will never be able to catch up. It's at such an advantage. It's in such a sort of money-making machine. Nobody else is going to be able to grow up and challenge it. And the critical thing for sport is, you know, will it become more pervasive? Will it knock out other sports? Will other sports die because of it? And then you reduce choice. And if you reduce choice, then you reduce the ability to be inclusive. You reduce the ability for people to choose the thing that's, you know, that they're best suited to, or that best, you know, they want to do. So I think there are some dangerous issues around some of that sort of commercialisation and sort of exponential growth within sport, as well as the sort of crisis modes that, you know, the big sports might be able to bat away, and small sports in that crisis mode might just implode.
I guess there's the synergies there which we've not mentioned with my Paralympic hat on, typical models in the Paralympics, although the responsibility by the IPC may be to make some technologies, you know, the limit perhaps the smartness of technology advancements for I guess, not fair competition, but work classification as well as technologies in wheelchair designs, like etc. But yeah, I guess I can sort of see quite a lot of synergies across the two presentations.
There's a similar parallel, so it's not related to automotive, but to technology, to what you mentioned, is you know, we look at the moment at the growth of data, and there's a lot of talk around the various different types of artificial intelligence. And to run machine learning, you need a lot of data. And if you look at the kind of the global platforms of this, so you know, whether it's your Googles or your Amazons or wherever, they have a significant advantage because they've been collecting, you know, terabytes of data for many years now, and they're beginning to be able to use that to kind of reinforce the insight and the investment they can then put into using that. And this kind of two-tiered increasing of the football country, and scale kind of then, you know, creates, you know, encourages itself to keep growing and actually often stops other things growing. And I think, you know, one of the concerns, if you look at the broader technology development around artificial intelligence, is, you know, how do we stop the kind of the big dominant, you know, kind of technology players from actually being able to advance significantly faster, and leave out those that then, you know, kind of the new innovations, the new startups that want to move into those areas. So there's an interesting parallel.
It is. I mean, in America they do it by, you know, I can't remember whether it's the NFL now, is that they baseball league where there's a sort of rebalancing of things where everybody has roughly the same sort of people, and you get first picks if you're the bottom of the league, and 1 year you get first picks, and the next one. But I think that there's a pretty much a sort of feeling that that's actually not really working. It's not terribly entertaining in many ways, because everybody ends up being equal and everyone takes their turn, and when you don't get these sort of flares and these fantastic things.
I'm more than about 10 minutes or so left, so I actually want to open out to questions from the audience where we can then debate as well. So we have some roving mics, although you might be loud enough to speak and ask the question, but I want to try to go sport, tech, and back and forth, and actually get a fair distribution, but okay.
There is a sport tech.
Sport
Can I ask you a question which applies to both of you, but in slightly different ways? So I think, if I was a challenger, I'd say there's a mismatch between your algorithm and public behaviour. So let me give you the football analogy, and then I'll give you the vehicle analogy. The football analogy is there's a group of fans who go and watch Chelsea every week, and that's exactly where they want Chelsea to be. They're not bothered about the teams over here, but more importantly, the owners of the club don't want. So as a consequence, the altruism will not realise itself because there's a group of people over here who have such significant control that they don't want the ideal situation that you described to happen. It's exactly the same to come back to Martin's point with past. There is an Aston Martin owner who will always want to own an Aston Martin. And actually, dare I say, the shareholders of Ford are on a loser if they adopt your approach, because the global car market shrinks so significantly that Ford's share price drops and the return to the shareholder isn't what the shareholder wants. So I'm just interested when you both have a view from your perspectives on your views and your approaches, which I think are laudable versus other people who have a stake, a significant stake, in both of your professional areas that almost runs counter to what you're proposing?
Yeah, I mean, if I take Chelsea's a good one, because it's who my eldest son and my husband support, and I don't. I completely agree with you. There are people, and actually the whole sport, globally, the sports governance world actually thinks very much in those terms. We're here, the party's good, we've got the bowl of fruit on our table, we seem to be doing okay. Why would we change? It's all okay out there. And Chelsea can do that and think that, but I think that the FA need to be thinking differently if they want to continue to bring people in and they want to continue to have investment in the lower teams. Otherwise, you're going to have, eventually, the logical conclusion to me is, why would you invest in Leeds United? I mean, I know they're poor examples, they've got somebody who's very, very keen on investing in them. Why would you invest in those teams that are down in the margins? Because they're never going to get. Why would you invest in somebody in the Championship? So the FA potentially could lose ultimately an awful lot of investment further down and across the organisation. The FA could also lose the potential for growth for British players, for example, English players, Scottish and Welsh players to play in the World Cup if they don't develop a broad base to keep people across the country engaged in their sport. So Chelsea might think that, they might be very happy, I'm sure they are very happy where they are. But I think that there are other people around, and ultimately they would lose out as well if football began to implode by that focus.
So I'll pick up on the same thing. I think it's kind of the governing bodies that will change it. You just need to see what's happened in London in the last 20 years, from congestion charging to cycle lanes to toxicity charges to what would be the kind of ultra low emission lanes, cost of parking. All of these things will increasingly make it a difficult choice to want to drive in the city. Just to be clear, Ford's business model is to continue making cars. We're not going to stop making cars, but it's different types of vehicles for an urban environment, and the change has to happen in urban environments because if not, we won't be able to move very far in Aston Martin. And you can already see with the types of tactics, I guess, that cities are using across Europe to change how people move in cities, and it's having an effect. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the nice measures. It can be charging people a lot of money or just banning it. And we just see the diesel and the combustion engine plants that are happening in cities to see that coming down the road.
Hand of that.
Very much. My name is Professor Paul Wells. I work here at Loughborough University in the School of Arts, English and Drama. And what am I doing here, you say? Basically, because I'm an advocate of STEAM rather than STEM, I have to say. And a small seed that I'd like to sort of just plant that might be happening in the FA is some recent work that I've just been doing there, where the England football team have grasped the idea, or certainly the management of the England football team, that the arts might actually be useful and creative practices might be useful and an understanding of the media might be useful in the re-education of young players and indeed older coaches and indeed the senior team. Simply because all of you referred to really major changes in media technologies, the impact of the media in changing the definitions of sport and transport, and yet we don't pay enough attention to the arts, media and entertainment as something that interrelates with all the things that you've been talking about. The kind of work that we've been doing is to try and bring some of those debates into what has been a technology, sport preoccupied, driving narrative of the FA, and I'm hoping that small seeds might be planted there. But the key issue at the heart of that, and this is my question, is the idea that for a long time, certainly Southgate has talked about the idea that the cultures of football particularly have been seen as anti-intellectual. And there's people at McLaren, for example, who have did some very nice animations to reinvent McLaren for young people, also said that the petrolhead culture was anti-intellectual. And I just wondered if there was a role for all of us to play to change those cultures of the anti-intellectual in order that we revise some of the kind of thinking behind these things. We can only, it seems to me, solve things if we communicate better how we might solve them. How do those thoughts appeal to you?
Well, I do have an arts background as well, so I'm completely on that front. There's two strands that make me think. One is that sport is increasingly being drawn into the media and entertainment business. I do think that I was astounded listening to the Inter Milan Chief Exec talking about, we are no longer a football club, we're a media and entertainment business, and our content is about football. So I think that will naturally change, and I think all of those professional sports will change. But I think the thing that is going to intellectualise, to some extent, sport is going to be the data and the insights that are available to people, engaging in it in a very different way. I mean, I've got 3 teenage children, and they're desperate to sort of see what's going on the field of play, to know where everyone is, to almost predict what the next move is going to be. And I think those sort of tactical things and understanding the tactics is something that's been lost to a lot of sports people for a while. They tend to just watch it because it's their team and things. So I think that sort of data and insight driven and that IT tech, the wearable tech stuff will begin to do that. I'm not sure that's arty in the sort of sense that I would think about it, but I think it will begin to intellectualise sport.
This is about representation of design. You use the word design a lot for both. Sport isn't designed to cars, half designed to what can be designed to make something change.
Yeah.
So you've got the perspective on the law of
media. If you think about the amount of hours people actually spend in vehicles, when you no longer have to hold the steering wheel and focus on the road, the number of those hours suddenly becomes very useful for repurposing for different things. I mentioned about using journeys to be productive, but obviously you can also use journeys for entertainment. You just go on any flight and you sit there, now you don't get the one movie, you get the 50 different movies. It takes you 15 minutes to scroll through to work out if you want to watch them again. When you've got that time available in the vehicle, suddenly the role of actually having content and links to media becomes increasingly important. Will car companies become media companies? Maybe not. Maybe like partnerships. That's increasingly, across all of these big ecosystems, it's actually how we drive partnerships to create an experience. So, I would expect to see a growing number of partnerships that enable a really rich content and entertainment experience within the vehicle in the future.
Can I just add to that? So one of the other things I saw last week was FC Roma have done a joint thing with I think Sony for the promotion of Venom for their new movie, and I think that's a really interesting partnership because normally entertainment and film see themselves as a direct rival to football. You were either going to watch a football match, watch Match of the Day on Saturday night, or you're going to go out to the cinema. Why would you partner the two together? How can they win?
Well, football clubs are signing gamers now, aren't they? Esports.
Yeah.
So they're often gaming and sport going together. All these cross-platform activities, I think, will merge.
Yeah. We just launched a vehicle at one of the biggest games events in Europe, games.com. So rather than go to one of the motor shows, we went to a gaming event to do it.
Thank you. I come from the design school. And for inclusive sports or mobility reimagined, I'm just wondering what relationships or partnerships are you trying to build with other stakeholders? Is it something collaborative and competition, cooperation, or something else?
Your question was around what types of partnerships are we looking to build to help redesign the future? Is that, did you say you're from School of Dance? Design. So we had a dance in our introduction, so I thought that was interesting. Well done. It's really kind of been very much part of the discussion over the last few years around the evolving role of partnerships. I mentioned it about media and content, and I think for lots of evolving innovation, as our world gets busier and more complex and more connected, partnerships and collaboration is going to be a key skill that is required for individuals to big companies, and I don't think we're that good at it. I think I'm not talking about Ford, I'm talking as a human being. I think it's something that we're going to have to learn to do a lot better. And there's so many different dynamics of if it's a big company with a startup, if it's government with one culture and way of working with a commercial-driven organisation. There's lots of different tensions that make it very challenging. And I don't think we know how it's going to play out, but I think we know we need to develop it as a skill, and we need to build partnerships and collaborations to actually develop that in the coming years. It's going to be a critical capability for us.
I think within sport we're very good at partnering with, particularly with slightly more design type companies in order to improve mobility and in order to sort of improve particularly the technology. So if I think about British Rowing, we partnered with McLaren, for example, on the design of our boats. We use various other, Vicky will give you much better examples. Wheelchair users will, they'll have an awful lot of engineering partnerships in order to sort of develop the strongest, lightest, most mobile type of chairs, for example, for some of the sports. Partnering with clothing companies, particularly, to be able to develop the right sort of clothing to make athletes as comfortable and so that they can perform at their best, and equally with nutrition companies and things. So within sport, we do an awful lot of those things quite naturally.
So we do in terms of, I guess, co-design, but I think it's kind of as a joint business model. That's when it becomes more challenging. So whether it's, there's commercial interest, there's data interest, there's IP, there's a whole bunch of things that make it harder. So I think we do partner for lots of different parts of the automotive, but I just think in terms of the kind of intersection of the business models is where it's going to be more challenging.
I think, of course, in the design school with George Havanat's work in textiles and clothing and comfort for athletes, obviously there's a great example there of some of the research that we do to sort of elite performance with athletes in that sense, and other environments that obviously we have to operate in as well.
I think Annamarie's been quite modest as well, and we're looking sometimes in very discrete lenses of sport, technology, collaboration together, but what we must not forget is actually the athletes themselves. So they've come through sport, and I think their perceptions, their understanding of the ecosystem is very valuable, not only in the sport product, the design of technology, and that is a key collaborative and partnership, I believe.
We've got one final question.
On the point of what is sport for, a lot of sports funding is about winning Olympic medals, to the point where British Canoeing cut off grassroots funding because it didn't enough medals. Is there not a problem there that the competition is strangling the sport itself?
Well, if I can, I'll just correct you on one thing. So grassroots funding is not connected to Olympic medals. So grassroots funding comes from Sport England, and Olympic funding comes from UK Sport, so they're separate bodies.
Sorry, UK's British Canoeing.
Yeah.
Overall budget
but there's a misconception, I think, that UK sport funding is based purely on medal outcome from a previous games, and that's clearly not true, because badminton would have been funded with its one bronze medal in that case in the following in this current cycle. Without being too boring about it, the funding for sports, for Olympic and Paralympic sports, is based not just on how they've done in the past. That's to do with their reputation for being able to deliver. But there's also some very careful predictions and analysis of every single athlete that's in the team. So you look at that athlete, what their data is for their performance, and what their age is, if they're likely to be peaking or have peaked, what the facilities are like, what the coaching staff are like, how well the program is working. So there's a whole combination of things. You know, that with an ever sort of shrinking or tightening amount of money, and with the collaboration that we have across sports at the moment, things like the EIS, which is partly based here, and with UK sport performance programs, you know, we share a lot of data. So rowing will help hockey, and hockey will help canoeing, and canoeing will help somebody else. You know, all of the British sports have all come up together. I think it's a really good example, perhaps, of the Chelsea Football Club scenario, that actually Team GB and Paralympics GB actually want to bring sports up collectively. And that is putting a stress on the funding that we have. It is, you know, do we spread it more thinly over everybody and hope everybody does mediocrely, or do we focus it in on the sports that we know can deliver? Thankfully, it's not my job to decide, but it is the great $1 million question, really.
Any final observations before we wrap up?
Well, I just had a comment. The question seemed to be a little bit about inclusion from grassroots, and I would comment that we would need to think about the same thing in intelligent mobility as well, actually. People, particularly older people, are not quite so savvy when it comes to, you know, using Uber on their phone and all this kind of stuff. And actually, we need to make sure we don't lose people in the process, actually.
No, I mean, I obviously just sort of want to echo the quote that Annamarie says to us, sort of the bit about motion. You know, it's stable, but we need to be agile, we need to have the agility, and I think that's the key thing that we can all take away, is really thinking about the challenges of innovation and how we work together to be agile and reactive rather than sort of waiting for the moment, that tipping point, so we're always preparing rather than responding.
I guess just to build on that, I've had a couple of conversations around this today, but you know, as a company looking to, you know, kind of build innovation, build thinking at a time of such rapid change, what we really need from an academic perspective is to think about how you work with us in those very fast-paced cycles. You know, on a lot of our traditional programs, which we've worked with universities on, particularly here at Loughborough, they're 4-6 year programs which work when you're developing a future powertrain or future engine. But when you're developing something for an industry that changes within a 3-month period, you're thinking about how we work together in an agile way is going to be critical to us jointly shaping what the kind of future of mobility, and I would imagine sport as well.
I'd also like to thank the panel for their time and efforts to me tonight. I know food and drink are waiting for us. If the panel would give a round of applause to the panel. A reminder of our forthcoming visitors, and obviously we're trying to ensure that we influence as many people as possible through the IAS, not only our internal staff as well, but obviously some of our key external partners as well. And so please, those individuals who were able to come tonight from our external partnerships, hope to be hearing a lot more from the IAS around the presentation that you might wish to come to over the year. But that's certainly the timetable as it stands right now over the next sort of 9 to 12 months. I'd like to thank you all for taking your Monday evening to spend with us and hearing our guest speakers in the panel debate. And not just thank you all, but particularly thanks to my team, to Vicky, and to the theme leads who are here, and to Helen, Ty and Marsha from the IAS office for putting such a fantastic presentation and evening together with me. So thanks a lot for all that hard work you're putting behind. Thank you all. For each of the visitors who come to campus, they'll traditionally be here for probably between 3 to 5 days or a week. They will be doing probably a public lecture or a
a high-profile lecture here, as well as meeting up with our fellow academics to build our research partnerships and legacy going forward, and meeting up with our early career researchers and PhD students, as well as hopefully some of our external partners. So please look out for the visits when they come onto the calendar over the next few months. So before we leave, I'd obviously like to most importantly thank our two guest speakers, and we have a few little gifts for them on behalf of Loughborough University to present. So thanks a lot, everyone. One round of applause.